The rifle came up out of the burned doorway before Silas had even stepped down from his horse. And the woman holding it said, in a voice scraped flat by smoke and grief, that the next man who set a boot on her land would be buried in it. He had ridden 2 days through dry country to claim a ruin he had bought sight unseen for $40. And now there was a barrel steady on his chest, and a soot-streaked widow behind it who had no idea she was about to hand a wandering stranger the one thing that would change both their lives. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The bay horse blew dust and shifted, and Silas kept his hands wide and open and away from his sides. The deed folded soft in the left one, the right one empty as a man could make it. He looked at the rifle first, because that was sense, and then he looked at her, because that was harder. She was young under the ash, maybe 26, slight and worn thin, with honey blonde hair come loose from its braid and a face that had not slept in days. Her eyes were a tired hazel, and they did not waver. The dress she wore had been a soft blue once. The hem of it was gray with cinders. Behind her, the house was gone. Not damaged, gone. The roof had fallen into the rooms, and the rooms had fallen into the cellar, and what stood now was a black skeleton of beams against a hard, bright Wyoming sky, a single chimney leaning like a tooth in an empty jaw. A thread of smoke still rose somewhere in the wreck, days old, refusing to die. Past the house, the barn was the same, a roofless cage of charred posts. The fences sagged. Everything a man builds in a life had been built here, and then it had burned, and the smell of it still hung over the whole place like a held breath. Silas had seen burned-out places before. He had never seen a living woman standing guard in the middle of one. "I bought this land," he said. He pitched it slow and even, low in his chest, the tone a man saves for a spooked horse he does not want to bolt. "Paid the agent in town. $40 and the deed in my saddlebag. I didn't know anyone was living here." "No one is living here," she said. "There's nothing left to live in." "There's you." The barrel did not drop, but something in her face flinched just slightly, like a candle when a door opens somewhere far off in a house. She did not answer that. He understood, looking at her, that she had heard 100 careful voices in the last week, men in town with their hats in their hands, telling her gently and not so gently that there was nothing here for her anymore, that the bank and the county and every sensible soul for 50 miles had decided it, and that she ought to be reasonable. He understood that she had stopped believing reasonable people. So he did the only thing he could think to do, which was to take the worn brass pocket watch out of his vest and open it and turn it so the cracked glass faced her. "My wife," he said, "and my boy. 8 years back, the cholera took them both inside a week, and I have been riding ever since because I could not stand to stay any place they had been. So I know what it is to keep standing in the ashes of a thing, because leaving it feels like burying it twice. I'm not here to put you out. I give you my word on that for whatever a stranger's word is worth to you." He thumbed the worn brass pocket watch open the way he always did when a place felt like a grave, looked at the cracked glass and the faded face inside, and closed it again before he rode down into the ashes. Then he sat his horse and waited, hands open, and let her decide whether to shoot him. She didn't shoot him. After a while that felt very long. She lowered the rifle so the barrel pointed at the dirt between them, which was not trust, but was not death either, and she said her name was Maribel, and that the land was hers no matter what paper he carried, and that he could water his horse at the creek and then he could go. Her name was Maribel Halloran. The ranch had been her husband's and his father's before him, a good spread of grass and water that ran further than a man could walk in a morning. Jeremiah Halloran had been dead 11 days. The fire had taken him with the house. The town had buried what they found of him on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the bank had called the note, and by the next week a land agent named Pruitt had a sign up and a price on the ruin. and somewhere in all of that, no one had thought to ask the widow where she meant to go. So she had not gone. She had dragged a bedroll and a cookpot into the one corner of the burned house where the floor still held, and she had stayed, sleeping under the open black beams, because the alternative was to admit that all of it was over, and she was not ready, and she did not know if she ever would be. Silas watered his horse. He did not leave. He told himself it was the horse needing rest. He told himself it was the long ride and the heat and the sense in not crossing dry country at midday. None of that was the truth, and he knew it. The truth was that he had spent 8 years not staying anywhere. And something about the sight of a woman holding a rifle over the grave of her whole life had reached into his chest and taken hold of a thing he thought had burned out of him a long time ago. If you have ever watched someone the whole world had written off keep standing in a place everyone told them to leave, and felt something in you quietly hope they would not have to do it alone, then you already understand why this channel exists, and you belong here. Take a moment to subscribe, because the stories I tell are all this one story in the end. The overlooked person and the quiet stranger and the small, unhurried kindness that gives a life back its worth. And the people who subscribe are the ones I am telling them for. So Silas stayed. Not in the house, which was no house, and not where she could see him, because he understood that a frightened person needs to believe they are alone, even when they are not. He made a cold camp out past the broken fence where the grass began, and he hobbled the bay, and in the last of the light he watched the small, careful fire she built in the ruin, and the small, careful way she banked it for the night, like a woman who had decided she would not also burn to death out of carelessness, since the fire had already taken everything else it was going to get. In the morning, he was up before her. He found the well, which had not burned, and he hauled the bucket and set a full pail of clean water by the place where the doorway used to be. And then he went back out to his camp and made himself coffee and waited. When she came out and found the water, she stood looking at it a long time. She did not thank him, but she used it. That was the shape of the first days. He did not ask to help. He simply did the next thing that plainly needed doing in plain sight, and left it done. He cleared the fallen rails from the gate so a wagon could get through. He dragged the worst of the charred timber off the yard and stacked it where it would not fall on anyone. He found her milk cow wandered half a mile off, dragging a broken tether, lowing with a bag gone tight and sore, and he eased her and led her back and never said a word about it. On the 4th day, he found the rusted pump on the well gone stiff and useless, and without a word he sat down in the dirt with it and worked at it for the better part of an afternoon, freeing the seized handle, packing the leather seal with tallow, until clean cold water came up out of the ground in a bright gush, and he could carry it to her by the bucket instead of the cupful. He mended the gate that had hung broken since the fire, so it swung true and latched. He set stones in a careful ring around her cook fire so a stray spark could not run loose in the dry grass and finish what the first fire had started. He never once told her he was doing any of it for her. He simply left each small mended thing behind him, like a sentence in a language she was slowly, against her will, beginning to understand. Maribel watched all of this from the burned doorway with the rifle never quite out of reach. And slowly, the way frost goes out of the ground, the rifle began to spend more of its time leaning against the wall instead of in her hands. The town was another matter. He rode in on the 3rd day for nails and flour and to look the land agent in the eye. The town was a single dusty street with a church at one end and a saloon at the other, and not much in between. And by the time he had tied his horse, the whole street knew that the drifter who had bought the cursed Halloran place was standing in it. They watched him from doorways. A wiry man in a green eyeshade leaning in the door of the freight office. Del Harmon, by the way folks said his name like a warning, called out to ask was it true he meant to live out there with the mad widow in the ashes, and laughed, and asked did he know the place was cursed? Did he know 3 men had already refused to buy it at any price? Did he know the woman had likely set the fire herself and was only waiting for a fool to come along she could burn next? Silas stopped. He looked at Del Harmon for a moment, and then he looked at the half-dozen others who had drifted close to enjoy it, and he said, mild as milk, that a man who had outlived his whole family had used up about all the fear he had to spare, and that they were welcome to come tell the widow to her face what they were so brave about telling her behind her back. Then he went into the mercantile and bought his nails. Nobody followed him to say anything to anyone's face. But the name stuck to him in the street after that, as such names always stick. The Drifter and the Mad Widow. The Ash Man. He had been called worse, and by people he respected more. The land agent was a soft, heavy man named Pruitt, with mutton chop whiskers gone gray, and a brown-checked waistcoat strained over a comfortable belly, and a way of smiling that never reached his eyes. He was a great deal less comfortable when Silas filled his doorway. Silas asked him plainly why a working ranch with good grass and a live well had sold for $40 to a man who had never seen it. Pruitt spread his soft hands and spoke of the fire and the curse and the talk in town and the bank wanting only to be rid of a bad piece of paper and how lucky a drifter was to get any land at all at that price and how a wise man would take his luck and not go poking at it. Silas listened to all of it. He had spent 8 years listening to men, and he had gotten good at hearing the one sentence under all the others. The sentence under Pruitt's was this: there was something about that land worth a great deal more than $40, and Pruitt knew exactly what it was, and Pruitt did not want it found. Silas thanked him for his time, which was its own small cruelty, and rode back out to the ashes. Days settled into a kind of rhythm. He cleared and she let him, and the silence between them stopped being a wall and started being a room they were both standing in. She began to leave coffee out on a flat stone for him in the mornings, strong and bitter, the way he learned she had made it for Jeremiah. He began to leave the better cuts of whatever he shot at the edge of her cook fire, a rabbit dressed and ready, a brace of quail, never with any words attached. One evening she asked him, without looking at him, what his wife's name had been, and he told her, and she nodded as if he had handed her something heavy and she would carry it carefully. That was the night he set the watch on the flat stone between them, open, so she could see the photograph, and said the only thing he knew how to say to a frightened person, which was nothing at all. The cracked glass of the watch caught the firelight and threw a small, trembling coin of brightness onto the charred wall. And for the first time in a long time, the burned house did not look entirely like a tomb. It could not last as a truce. He had bought the land. The paper in his saddlebag said it was his, every blackened acre of it, and they both knew that sooner or later that paper would have to mean something, and that when it did, one of them would have to leave. Maribel knew it better than he did. She had begun those nights to dig. He found her at it one gray dawn, down in the collapsed mouth of the cellar, on her knees in the wet ash with her hands black to the elbow, hauling at something half buried under a fallen beam. She had been doing it for nights, he realized. There was a whole section cleared that he had not cleared. When she saw him, she went still and fierce, like an animal over the last of its food, and he understood all at once that the rifle and the staying and the refusing to leave had never only been grief. She had been guarding something. She had been digging for something, and she had not trusted him, or anyone, enough to say so. If you have made it this far into Maribel's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. He did not ask her to move. He got down into the ash beside her, and he set his shoulder against the fallen beam. And he lifted, and the two of them together dragged out of the burned ground a dented iron strongbox the size of a seed chest. Its lock melted shut, its sides scorched black. They carried it up into the daylight between them. Silas worked the ruined lock with a cold chisel and a careful hand, and when the lid finally gave and swung back on its blackened hinge, the both of them looked down into the one thing in all that ruin the fire had not been able to reach. There was money in it. Not a fortune in coin, But enough, a canvas sack of gold pieces and banknotes that Jeremiah had clearly been setting by against a hard year. But the money was not the thing. Under the sack lay a leather-bound ledger, scorched along its edges but whole, and folded inside the ledger was a survey map of the whole valley. And across the map, in a county clerk's careful hand, ran the lines and the legal words that named a thing Maribel had half known and never been able to prove. The Halloran land sat over the only live, year-round spring for 30 miles, and Jeremiah had not merely owned the ground. He had gone to the county seat and registered the water right to that spring, a deeded, recorded right that controlled whether the creek ran in the dry months, which meant it controlled whether a single head of cattle could graze the whole eastern half of the valley through a Wyoming August. The burned ranch that the town called Worthless Ash, the ruin that had sold for $40, was in fact the most valuable 40 acres in the county, because whoever held that spring held the whole valley by the throat. Maribel found the letter last. It was tucked flat against the bottom of the box, in an envelope gone brown at the edges, and her own name was on it in her husband's hand. She read it standing in the ash with the bright morning sun on the scorched paper, and Silas watched the blood go out of her face and her hand come up to her mouth. And he did not need to read it to know it had broken her open. She read it twice. Then she gave it to him because she could not say the words, and he read what a dead man had written to his wife the week before he died. Jeremiah had known they were in danger. Otis Crane, who ran the big spread to the north and who had wanted the Halloran Spring for 20 years, had come to him 3 times that summer with an offer for the water right, each one fatter than the last, and each time Jeremiah had said no. The last time, Crane had not bothered to be polite. He had told Jeremiah that grass was dry this year, and dry grass burned, and that a careful man thought hard about his family before he made an enemy of the only neighbor with the water to fight a fire. Jeremiah had written it all down, the dates, the offers, the threat in Crane's own words, and he had sealed it in the strongbox with the deed and the map. And he had written to Maribel that if anything ever happened to him, she was to take the box to the circuit judge and to no one else because the agent in town, Pruitt, was Crane's man and always had been. The fire had come 4 nights later. She had not been mad. She had not been guarding ashes out of grief alone. She had been guarding the one box in the world that could prove her husband had been murdered for his water and hang the men who did it. And she had stayed in the burned house with a rifle because the moment she left, those same men would have the place to themselves to dig. Silas folded the letter along its old creases and gave it back to her. And for a while the two of them sat in the wrecked yard with the box between them and said nothing at all. A meadow lark sang somewhere out in the grass, indifferent and sweet. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet and very steady. He told her she had been carrying this alone for 11 days. He told her she did not have to carry it alone anymore. And then he pressed the brass watch into her ash-streaked hand and folded her fingers over it, and told her, quietly, that a man kept the people he had lost where he could feel them, and that she could too. She held it against her chest with both hands, the stopped watch and the dead man's letter together. And she breathed, and for the first time since the fire, she did not look like a woman standing watch over a grave. She looked like a woman who had found, in the worst place imaginable, one person willing to stand the watch with her. But knowing a thing and proving it are 2 different miles of road, and the men who had burned the Halloran Ranch were not finished. Word travels in a small county. By the time Silas rode in to ask the circuit judge's schedule, Pruitt already knew the box had been found because Del Harmon's boy had seen them haul it up into the light and had run his mouth for the price of a soda cracker. That same afternoon, Otis Crane came to the ranch. He came on his gray horse with 2 of his hands behind him, a tall, lean man near 60 with a face like cracked saddle leather and an iron gray mustache and a long oilskin duster too heavy for the heat, and he sat his horse at the broken gate and looked over the ruin with the flat ownership of a man who already considered it his. He told Maribel he had come to make a Christian offer, seeing as she was a widow alone with no means and no house and a piece of burnt dirt she could not work. He named a price for the land, a generous price, he said, more than the place was worth. Silas, leaning on the fence with his hands easy and the brass watch on its chain at his vest, said that the place was worth a great deal more than Crane was offering, and that they both knew exactly why, and that the lady was not selling. Crane's eyes moved to him then, and the friendliness went out of them like water out of a cracked jug. "You don't know this country, Drifter," Crane said. "Land out here can be a dangerous thing to hold on to. Ask her husband." It was the wrong thing to say. He knew it the moment it left him. Maribel went white and then very still, and Silas straightened off the fence in a way that was not fast but was final. And the two of them looked at Otis Crane until Crane gathered his reins and said something about giving her time to come to her senses and turned his horse. But he had said it. In front of a witness, he had as good as told them he knew how Jeremiah Halloran had died, and all three of them rode away from that gate knowing it. The darkest stretch came after. That night someone fired the grass. Silas smelled it before he saw it. The dry crackle and the orange line creeping up out of the south draw on the night wind, set to run with the breeze straight at the ruin and the strongbox, and the woman asleep beside it. He was up and shouting and beating at it with a wet saddle blanket before he had his boots laced, and Maribel came out of the burned house with the rifle in one hand and a shovel in the other, and the two of them fought that fire in the dark for the better part of an hour, choking, blistered, throwing dirt and dragging the cow and the horse clear until the wind turned at the creek and the flames guttered out against the wet ground along the spring. Beaten by the very water a dead man had registered against exactly this. When it was over, they stood in the scorched grass, black to the eyes and shaking, and Maribel began quietly to laugh, which frightened him until he understood it. They had tried to burn her out a second time, and they had failed because the very thing the men were killing to steal, the live water that ran when all the rest of the country went to tinder, was the thing that had just saved the proof of their crime. The spring had put out the fire they set to bury it. It could not go on. The next fire, or the next dark night, might end differently. Silas told her in the gray morning after that they were not going to wait in the ashes to be burned a third time. They were going to take the box to the circuit judge, the way Jeremiah had written. And they were going to do it in the open, in the daylight, with witnesses, where Crane and Pruitt could not make them quietly disappear. Maribel was afraid and said so, because she had learned what these men would do. But she had also learned, in 11 hard days and the handful that followed, that the dust-caked stranger who had ridden down into her ashes did not run, and did not lie, and did not leave. So she pinned up her hair, and she put on her shawl, and she rode into town beside him with the strongbox roped between them and her dead husband's letter against her heart. They did not arrive alone, and that was the thing Silas had not expected. Kindness, he was learning, moves through a place quieter than cruelty, but it moves all the same. While he had been clearing timber and hauling water, the better people of that town had been watching too, and they had drawn their own conclusions about who the drifter was and who the widow was, and what the smug men at the freight office were really protecting. So, when Silas and Maribel rode in with the scorched strongbox rope between their horses, they were not as friendless as Crane had counted on. Tabitha Meade met them first. She was a stout, silver-haired widow of about 60 with a face made for kindness and a buckboard already loaded, and she had heard about the grass fire, and she climbed down with a basket of bread and cold chicken and asked Maribel the only question that mattered, which was whether she had eaten, and did not wait for an answer before she started feeding her. A boy of about 10 named Eli, Tabitha's grandson, had taken to Silas in the mercantile days before, since children and animals make up their minds about a dangerous-looking man long before the grown people do. And Eli ran ahead now to hold the horses and to tell anyone who would listen that the ash man had pulled a whole burning ranch back from the fire with his own 2 hands, and Reverend Stowe, a grave, gray-bearded old man who had buried Jeremiah Halloran and had never once believed the comfortable lie that the fire was an accident, came down off the church steps and walked beside them to the door of the county building so that any man who meant to stop them would have to do it in front of the minister. The circuit judge held court that week in a plain plank room behind the land office, a long pine table and a single window and a Bible to swear on. He was a spare old man with a gray beard and spectacles and the patient, unfooled look of someone who had spent 30 years listening to men lie to his face. Pruitt was there, having heard what was coming, sweating in his checked waistcoat and trying to smile. Crane did not come, which told its own story to everyone in the room. Silas laid the strongbox on the table and opened it, and one piece at a time he laid the contents out in the daylight from the window. The canvas sack of gold. The scorched ledger with Jeremiah's accounts in his own hand. The survey map with the county clerk's seal and the registered water right plain upon it. And the letter, the dated, detailed letter, naming Crane's 3 offers and Crane's exact threat and naming Pruitt as Crane's man. In the courtroom, he laid the watch on the table beside the scorched ledger, and the judge looked at the stopped hands and the burned pages together as if the two of them told one long, quiet story. Then Silas stepped back because he had learned that the strongest thing a man can do is sometimes to go quiet and let the truth speak for itself. And he let Maribel tell it. And she did. In a low, steady voice that did not shake, the widow everyone in that town had called mad stood at the pine table and told the circuit judge exactly what had been done to her husband and her home. And she had the dead man's own words and the county's own seal to prove every line of it. She did not weep. She did not beg. She laid the proof down the way Jeremiah had told her to, in front of the one honest man he had named, and she let it stand. Pruitt tried, of course. He blustered about a grieving woman's fancies and a drifter's scheme to steal good land with forged papers, and he reached for the survey map as if he might simply take it. The judge stopped him with one raised finger. The judge had seen the county clerk's seal. The judge had handled enough forgeries to know real records from a desperate man's lies, and these were real. Every page. He asked Pruitt one quiet question, which was how it was that the land office had sold a parcel carrying a registered water right worth thousands of dollars for the sum of $40 to a stranger passing through, and whether Pruitt would care to explain that arithmetic under oath, with the penalty for swearing falsely being what it was. Pruitt opened his mouth. Pruitt closed it. And in that small silence, the whole comfortable lie that had buried Jeremiah Halloran came apart in front of the room. The judge did not bang a gavel or make a speech. He simply took out his pen and began to write, slow and certain, an honest man doing the plain work set in front of him. He set the fraudulent sale aside, every dollar of it. He ordered the water right and the deed restored to the name of the widow Halloran, where they had always lawfully belonged. And he wrote out a warrant in his own careful hand for the arrest of Otis Crane on the charge of arson and the unlawful killing of Jeremiah Halloran, to be served by the territorial marshal, with the dead man's letter entered as evidence, and Silas and the reverend and the boy all sworn as witnesses to what Crane had said at the gate. It was done in less than an hour. The men who had counted on a frightened widow having no one and no proof had reckoned without both. They had not counted on a drifter who would not leave, and they had not counted on a dead man careful enough to write it all down. And they had most of all not counted on the plain, stubborn fact that the burned, worthless, cursed land they had killed to steal had been guarding its own evidence all along, in an iron box the fire could not open. The rebuilding took the rest of that summer, and it did not happen as Maribel had feared it would, alone and grim and grieving. It happened as the best things on the frontier always did, all at once and with the whole valley's hands. Once the truth was out, the town seemed to remember itself. People who had crossed the street to avoid the mad widow now found reasons to drive their wagons out the Halloran Road. Tabitha Meade came near every day, and she brought other women with her. and they scrubbed and cooked and aired the dusty rose quilt that had survived in the strongbox corner. And they filled the new days with the ordinary warm noise that a place needs to stop being a tomb. Reverend Stowe organized a barn raising, and on a bright Saturday in late summer, 30 neighbors came with their tools and their teams and their dinner baskets, and they raised the frame of a new barn against the blue Wyoming sky in a single, long, ringing day. Silas worked among them with his sleeves shoved up and the sweat cutting clean lines through the soot on his arms. And young Eli ran underfoot carrying nails and water and pride. And at noon, they all sat down together in the grass to eat, the drifter and the widow at the center of a table full of people who, a month before, would not say her name. And the small kindnesses did not stop when the barn was up. Tabitha Meade came back the next morning with a tin of fresh butter and a thermos of broth, the way she had said she would, and the morning after that with mending thread and a hen for the new coop, asking each time only whether they had slept and whether they had eaten before she would hear a word of thanks. Old Pratt, the carpenter, left a box of good hand tools on the porch with no note. The Reverend brought a Bible with the Halloran name written fresh inside the cover and pressed it into Maribel's hands and said a place was not gone as long as somebody remembered its name. They came uninvited, all of them, and they came back the next day regardless, which is the only kind of help that ever truly mends a person. Otis Crane was taken by the territorial marshal at his own gate and bound over for trial in the fall, and the men who had laughed in the freight office found, all at once, that they had always known he was a hard man and had never trusted him. No. Pruitt closed his land office and left the county in the night and was not greatly missed. The water right was Maribel's again, recorded and clean. And the first cattlemen of the dry season came to her hat in hand to ask, politely now, whether they might pay to water their herds at the Halloran Spring, and she let them at a fair price, and the burned ranch that had sold for $40 began, quietly, to make her a wealthy woman. But that was never the part that mattered, and Silas and Maribel both knew it. What mattered came slower and quieter in the spaces between the work. It was in the way he learned to make her bitter coffee, and she learned to leave the cup where he liked it. It was in the evenings on the half-built porch when they did not talk so much as sit. Two people who had each lost a whole world and had stopped expecting to be handed another one. It was in the day she stopped sleeping in the burned corner and let him build her a real room with a real roof, and the night, weeks later, when she told him quietly that the ranch was too much land for one woman to hold, and looked at him until he understood that she was not talking about land. He was a man who had ridden 8 years to outrun a grief. She was a woman who had stood 11 days in the ashes of hers. Neither of them said the large words quickly because people who have been broken once are careful with such things. But they said them. In their own time, they said them. Silas had ridden down into those ashes a stranger who owned a worthless ruin. He stayed and became a man who belonged to a place and a person again, which was the one thing all his $40 could never have bought. On an evening in the early fall, with the trial behind them and the new barn sound and the fence run new and pale all along the road, the two of them stood out by the porch rail and watched the light go down gold and long across the grass. The cattle moved easy at the water. Smoke rose clean and white from a real chimney for the first time since the fire. Somewhere out in the dusk, a meadowlark sang the day down, and the first stars came out hard and clear over Wyoming. And Maribel, who was 26 and had a whole life again in front of her, where a month ago she had only had ashes, leaned her shoulder lightly against his. He took the worn brass pocket watch out of his vest one more time and opened it, and this time he did not close it quickly. He let her hold it. She looked at the cracked glass and the faded photograph of the woman and the boy he had carried across 8 empty years, and she did not say she was sorry for his losing them, because that was not a thing words helped, and she did not promise to be them because she could not be. She only held the watch in her 2 work-roughened hands as the last of the light came through the cracked glass, and after a while he laid his calloused hand over both of hers. On the porch rail at sundown, the brass watch lay open between their 2 hands, the stopped hands of it pointing at nothing, the cracked glass holding the last of the light, and neither of them moved to pick it up because it was finally At long last, home. Tabitha Mead was in the kitchen window behind them, humming. Eli was asleep in the new hayloft where he had begged to stay the night. The Reverend's wagon was a small dark shape going home down the long pale road. They were not alone. They would not be alone again. A home is not the house that stands or the house that burns. It is the person who will not leave you standing in the ashes alone. I would like to know where you are watching this from tonight, so if you have a moment, leave the name of your town in the comments, because there is something quietly fine about a whole scattered company of strangers sitting up late together, all of us listening to the same small story about kindness in the dark. And before you go, tell me this. If you had ridden 2 days to claim a ruin and found a frightened stranger living in its ashes with nothing left in the world, would you have shown your paper and put her out, the way every reasonable person in town would have called you a fool not to? Or would you have done what Silas did and gotten down off your horse and stayed?